Hey guys, welcome back to the garden on this moody afternoon. This is going to be the second garden tour that I'm doing this year. If you want to go back and check out the first one, I'll link it below. I wanted to walk through the garden while it was sort of at like its fullest possible potential. I actually went back and watched the first garden tour that I did, and I was almost in shock at where things actually started. And I know that sounds silly, but when you're planting in the spring and you're so anxious for things to grow, it seems like things really do take forever. So I'm going to walk through the garden with you guys really quick and kind of show you where we ended up. I will say that you are going to see a lot of weeds. We had a lot of trial and error this year, and sometimes the garden just doesn't get weeded like it should. If anything, this video is just for me to look back on. In years to come, I kind of want to see where our garden started and see what the peak of success was the first year, and use that as an encouragement and a learning tool moving forward. So here's the front gate like before. Walking in, I ended up not being able to get cattle panels this year. I just kind of needed to make do with what I had. So I had some rolls of chain link fencing, so I just stapled that to this. Those tiny little cucumber plants grew all the way up. There are still a few cucumbers hiding out here. On this side, this one didn't get near as big. When this one was completely full, all the foliage covered this entire fence here, and it was actually quite pretty. So do you remember that little lamb's quarter that was growing here? Well, I left it. Here it is. It's about 5 feet tall. Here's a sunflower that I put right next to this post. I leave these and let these seeds fully come on. I plan on using these for next year. Next to the cucumbers is this rainbow chard that did really well. This plant came in a quad, and I'll show you the other ones. It's so interesting to me, the soil nutrients and the imbalance of it throughout the garden. There's no consistencies. This one did really well here, and there's others in the garden that just basically didn't grow at all. Behind it is the chives. This little plant that was earlier named a lavender turned out to be a green pepper plant. We harvested, I think, maybe 1 or 2 green peppers off of here. There was a pile of compost here along the line where the fence will go, and there was a lot of volunteer plants. As you can see here, this is a spaghetti squash that was a volunteer. I mean, it's not very big. Here's my hand for comparison. You can see it's not very big. All in this area is currently weeds, except for this marigold plant. But this was all peppers in here, and they pretty much did nothing. In the garden, a lot of times I would put something, wait for it to grow, and if I never saw any growth, I would just plant something else. There's a couple rows of beans in here. We've gotten a handful or so off of them. This is the other area of pepper plants right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Couple more in here. We got a couple off of them, but none of them were super huge. This one's small. We did get some that were bigger than this. I did have to put quite a bit of bone meal and blood meal on to get anything. So we did have some dill come up. What was interesting is that I had actually planted a whole bunch of dill throughout this whole area. This dill came up, and I assumed that nothing else would come up, so I planted some beans in here. So the beans came up, but then if you come over here, you'll see that we actually did have some dill come up. And if you take it in your hand and kind of mush it, also, while dahlia tubers were on sale, I put some in here. I have no idea if dill and dahlia make good companion plants, but I think they are beautiful. I especially think these dark red ones are so pretty. In the paths, you'll see that there's cardboard. Well, you won't see it, but there's cardboard underneath all of these wood chips. And this is really the only area here that we had a problem with. I don't think the cardboard was thick enough, or maybe there's some smaller pieces that were here that just aren't covering as much, so then weeds did come up there. But for the most part, not having to weed the paths, this cardboard worked fantastic. Here's another little dwarf sunflower. The 2-year-old's garden bed. She had some flowers that came up, but ultimately the weeds won. My son kept putting things in his garden, and then he would dig them out and be like, I don't want to take care of this anymore, so he would put it somewhere in mine. So I don't really think there's anything in his anymore. Here's my daughter's garden. She had this zinnia plant that did really well. And as you can imagine, as most little girls would, she was so in love with these flowers. Then we have our pear trees. This pear tree is so heavy with pears. We actually need to harvest this and set these out to ripen. They did so well. These pears are beautiful and huge, and I'm excited for these. Okay, let's talk about this garden. This is where the beans were. We have let them go now. This is where the potatoes were. That's where the sweet corn is. That is now past its prime, and most of the ears have been long picked off. The potatoes, though, we had a pretty hot and dry spell, and then we just got doused with rain. Potatoes don't like their feet wet. That's something that we learned a lot about this year. They just kind of all rotted, so that's a bummer. That's part of the learning process. Next year we hope to make this space bigger and add a lot of compost, wood chips, and mulch and different things like that to kind of raise this space up. I know it doesn't look like much, but we had those tiny plants that were over here. I thought a couple of these were cantaloupe. Well, as it turns out, none of them were. The only real pest we've had a problem with, I'm assuming they're squash beetles. I've never had to deal with them before. Most of what's here didn't do well because of those. Instead of cantaloupe, they were tiny pumpkins. I was correct about the watermelon plant. It's not super huge, but it is growing. Continuing on, we had sunflowers that did well. These were all Roma tomatoes. There are some other tomatoes in here as well. This one is not a Roma. We had some that were huge that were harvested out of here. We had a couple beefsteaks and a couple yellows that came out of here. In front of the tomatoes, I had a bunch of lettuce planted. These are the only ones that came up. This is actually lettuce that has bolted, which means it's been too hot for it. It's going to seed, since the plant's main goal is to self-preserve, and it does that through reseeding itself. We have some more tomatoes against the back here. This one's actually really tall. Here's the basil plant. That guy did really well. And behind him, another sunflower. Here's a few more tomato plants. It looks like this one got attacked by chickens. We had the chickens all enclosed for a while, and then once the garden passed its peak, we kind of let them out, and leftover fruit like this is an easy target for a destructive chicken. Here's some more bolted lettuce. Here's another marigold. I find these so beautiful. And then we're back to the beginning where we started. Now let's address our center square. This has been one of the most beautiful sections of the garden, and it kind of happened a little bit by accident. So we'll start here in the front. Do you remember all those onions that were doing so well? Well, when we got the heavy rain, this is actually a low area in the garden, and they all flooded out. A couple of them survived, not nearly as many as we originally had. Next to the path, here's another rainbow chard. This guy right here, here's my hand for reference, came from the same quad that this one did. Here's my hand for reference. The top of this leaf comes probably about mid-thigh on me. So this one came from the same quad that this one did. Here's the cabbage that we put in. These are not much bigger than when we put them in. Yes, they are a little bit bigger, but really not by much. Again, that's part of the imbalance in our soil. There's only so much you can do in 1 year. This area of the garden has been so fun. I just planted some zinnia seeds. I actually don't even remember planting these cosmos. I thought maybe it was a weed, but they were kind of in a row here, so they seemed a little bit intentional, so I just left them. They actually are something. And these have just been so fun to see. Next to the cosmos and zinnias, we have the sunflowers. I'm actually really surprised at how well these did. I planted them in August. I didn't really think they would get to be this big, but most of these are taller than me, and I'm 5'6". Here's the other basil plant. It's still very fragrant. Okay, so behind here is the teepee trellis. The snap peas that were here didn't last very long in the heat we had in June. But this plant here, that is growing over everything and into the walkway. We had no idea what this was. We knew it was some kind of vine. We weren't really sure what it was when we put it in. But as it grew and matured, we discovered that they were birdhouse gourds. And they did so stinking well. I don't know what it is about poor soil, but it seems like birdhouse gourds are quite low maintenance. There's a bunch of different sizes and shapes. What's actually really funny about this, though, is that it's right next to the sunflowers. You can see it kind of vining all the way through, coming out down here. It's actually all the way over here into the zinnias. And here's a tiny birdhouse gourd. It's also climbing up the sunflowers. This guy really took advantage of the height and strength of the sunflowers here, and if he's just that excited about growing, I'm just gonna let him. Oh, look at this. I want to show you this. So this is just a regular sunflower stem. This is actually the main head of the sunflower. Out of the armpit of the plant, there's like sunflowers growing. That is not something I understand or have ever seen before, but it's kind of cool. Now I'm on the opposite side of the garden. That's the gate where we walk in. This was a melon plant. Out of all the ones that I thought was not, this one actually turned out to be. This is another low spot. It's right across from the onions, and it just got taken over by weeds. When we were really dry and then had a lot of rain, most of the stuff in here died. It was just way too wet. And this is where the weeds got the better of me. I mean, really, the weeds got the better of me everywhere. But here in particular, I didn't want to disrupt the root systems of the cherry tomatoes in here, and so I just left them. Obviously, that means it probably took a lot of the nutrients from these guys, but we still got snacks off of them. Next to the cherry tomatoes is the mint. I don't know if you remember how small this guy was, but this one also did really, really well. So that's the end of this video, guys. I really enjoyed looking back and seeing where we started and seeing where it is now. And the thing is, it's not perfect. It's not the tidiest garden, but I really enjoyed the process. And a lot of gardening is based on thinking about what you did last year and improving on that this year, and then taking what you learned from this year and moving it into next year. I already have a lot of ideas in mind for next year's garden. There's plenty of things that I would do differently. I have much higher hope in my heart for next year, because we're going to be one more year further into the process and amending the soil, and we're going to have another year of education under our belt. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.